All right, so we're talking about hormone release. We've been talking about hormones this entire chapter, part of the endocrine system. And the levels of hormones within the blood are going to be controlled by negative feedback systems. Now, we should remember, because we've talked about negative feedback all year long, that this is a way to fine tune the amount of something. So we can keep the levels of hormones within a very narrow, desirable range. And that could be triggered by either endocrine gland stimulation directly or by modulation of the endocrine gland release using the nervous system. For endocrine glands to be stimulated, there are three basic ways that endocrine glands detect and respond to changes in the environment. It could be humoral stimulation, which would be things in body fluids, neural stimulation, the nerves are hooked up to some of the endocrine organs, or other hormones can cause the stimulation to occur. So, humoral stimulation, changing blood levels of ions or nutrients, will directly cause that organ to secrete its hormone. We've seen this before when we've talked about calcium regulation. Declining levels of calcium in the blood will stimulate the parathyroid hormone to secrete, the parathyroid gland to secrete its hormone, parathyroid hormone. And that parathyroid hormone is going to act on the bones, on the digestive system, and on the kidneys to increase the amount of calcium in circulation. And as the amount of calcium in circulation goes up, the stimulus for releasing parathyroid hormone goes down. So the initial stimulus is low calcium in the blood. Parathyroid glands release parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone works to increase calcium in the blood. So we are reversing the initial stimuli, negative feedback loop. Neural stimuli, there are nerves that stimulate hormone release. We know the sympathetic nervous system stimulates the adrenal medulla to secrete the catecholamines. Hormonal hormones can stimulate other endocrine organs to release their hormones. We're going to look at this more closely as we get into individual endocrine organs. But the hypothalamus hormones tend to stimulate the release of anterior pituitary hormones, most of them. And the anterior pituitary hormones stimulate targets to secrete more hormones. So we have a hypothalamic pituitary target endocrine organ feedback loop. So there are three components to this feedback loop instead of the two that we typically have seen this year. The hormones from that final target organ are going to inhibit the release of the anterior pituitary hormones, usually by acting on the hypothalamus. Nervous system modulation. The nervous system can make adjustments to hormone levels when it's needed. It can modify stimulation or inhibit endocrine glands. Nervous system can override normal endocrine controls, for example, under times of severe stress or what we perceive as severe stress. The hypothalamus and the sympathetic nervous system override insulin, allowing blood glucose levels to increase, and that's part of our preparation for fight or flight. So, how do these hormones work on their targets? Well, target cell specificity is defined by the receptors for those hormones. So some hormones have very few cells that are their targets. The adrenocorticotropic hormone receptors are only found in the adrenal cortex. So those are the only cells that respond to ACTH, no matter how much is around. But then other hormones have receptors on many different cells. Thyroxine receptors are found on nearly all cells of the body. So when the levels of thyroxines go up, most cells in the body are going to respond to thyroxine. Target cell activation will depend on how much of the hormone there is in the blood, the number of receptors on the target cell, and how well the hormone binds to the receptor that's expressed on the target cell, and that would be called affinity or strength of binding. The amount of hormone can influence a number of receptors for that hormone, and there are a couple of ways you can do that. Some hormones will upregulate their receptors or the receptors of another hormone. Other cells will downregulate. They will lose receptors in response to high hormone levels. And that is used to desensitize the target cells to prevent them from overreacting uh, because those hormones may be persistently in the blood, depending on how quickly they're removed, which we'll get to in a second. And again, that brings us to half-life, onset, and duration of hormone activity. Hormones are going to circulate in the blood. We've said that over and over again. They're either free or they're bound. The steroid hormones and thyroid hormones are attached to plasma proteins because they are lipid soluble and plasma is a water-based solution. The other hormones circulate without carriers because they are water soluble, so they can float freely in the plasma. The concentration of those circulating hormones is going to be a reflection of how quickly they are released and how quickly they are removed and or inactivated. They can be removed from the body by enzymes that break them down. The kidneys can remove many of them. The liver removes a lot of them. So what we have is a description of the half-life. The half-life of anything is the time it takes to get rid of half of whatever you have. We talk about it in radiation. We can talk about it in many other situations, but now we're talking about hormones. So this is simply the time it takes to get rid of half of the amount of hormone you have. And that can vary anywhere from a fraction of a minute, if they're very unstable, to a week, if they are particularly stable. And that depends on the hormone and how it is removed. They have different response times. Some responses are immediate. Some, especially steroids, take hours to days. It takes a little while to get genes turned on and proteins manufactured. Some are not active until they enter the target cells. That would be the steroid hormones in particular. Mm-hmm. The duration of the response is usually limited, and that limit can be from 10 seconds to several hours. The effects disappear rapidly as blood levels drop. Some of them do persist in the blood at low levels. So the half-life, the onset, and the duration of hormone activity are depending mostly on whether the hormone is a water-soluble hormone or a lipid-soluble hormone. So lipid-soluble hormones are the steroid hormones and the thyroid hormone. They come from the adrenal cortex, the gonads, the thyroid gland. They're not stored in secretory vesicles. They're bound to plasma proteins in the blood, and they have a long half-life. Most of these have to be metabolized by the liver, so they have to be taken care of within the liver itself. And their receptors are usually inside the cell, and the activity of these steroid hormones and the thyroid hormone is to turn on genes, synthesize new proteins, so that those things take time. The water-soluble hormones would be all the amino acid-based hormones except for thyroid. All the other endocrine glands, except for the adrenal cortex, the gonad, and the thyroid, use water-soluble hormones. They tend to be stored in vesicles and then released, and they are usually free in the plasma. They don't need a carrier protein. Half-life is generally short. Most of them are removed by the kidneys. The receptors are on the plasma membrane. They can't cross the plasma membrane. They are not lipid soluble on their own, so they need an external receptor. And most of these are the ones that go through second messenger systems, as we went over the other day. All right, interaction with target cells. Multiple hormones act on the same target at the same time. If you have receptors for 2 or 3 different hormones, they are going to all be able to bind to that cell. And there are a couple of different ways that can happen. Permissiveness is when one hormone cannot exert its effects without another hormone being present. So reproductive hormones won't work unless thyroid hormone is present in order for them to have an effect. So in effect, thyroid is giving permission to the reproductive hormones to do their job. Synergism is more than one hormone produces the same effect on the target cell, and that gives you an amplification. So they are synergists, they work together. Glucagon and epinephrine both cause the liver to release glucose, for example. The third option is antagonism. They are antagonists of each other. One opposes the action of another. Good example of this we've talked about before too is insulin and glucagon. Insulin removes glucose from the blood. Glucagon raises blood glucose levels. That will bring us to the individual endocrine organs. So I'm going to stop this cast there. So, as they say in the business.